Hey everyone, today we're diving into the Battle of Neerwinden, a key moment in the War of the First Coalition during the French Revolutionary Wars. This is where the French Republican Army, despite a string of victories, faced a serious defeat against an alliance of Austrian and Dutch forces. It was a turning point that actually forced the French right out of Belgium and led one of their top generals, Charles François Dumouriez, to switch sides and defect to the Austrians. So, let's get into how this all unfolded and the intense buildup that led to this clash. By the end of 1792, France's revolutionary army seemed unstoppable. They just achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Valmy, which not only halted a Prussian invasion but also saved the revolution itself. Buoyed by that win, the French went on the offensive. They moved into the Rhineland, capturing cities like Worms, Frankfurt, and Mainz, while another army took control of Savoy and Nice almost effortlessly. But the real highlight that year was the Battle of Jemappes in November, where a French force, mostly made up of volunteers, managed to defeat a professional Austrian army in Belgium. This wasn't just any victory, it was a full sweep. By year's end, France controlled all of Belgium, and with that came a massive wave of patriotism and confidence. With this momentum, French leaders were pushing for even more expansion, claiming that their natural frontiers needed to reach the Rhine, the Alps, and the ocean to ensure the nation's safety. Revolutionary leader Georges Danton famously declared that France's borders were already defined by nature and that they'd secure them at every corner of the horizon. Then, in November, the National Convention issued something called the Edict of Fraternity, which basically promised support to any people fighting tyranny. This was a bold move that rattled many European leaders, especially in places like the Dutch Republic, which was right next to the newly conquered French territories in Belgium. The Dutch had a reason to be nervous, since they'd already experienced a failed revolution in the 1780s. And now, with the Edict of Fraternity, they worried the French would claim Dutch patriots were still oppressed and use that as an excuse for an invasion. As Austria and Prussia struggled against the French, the Dutch turned to Great Britain for protection. Britain had a long history of alliance with the Dutch dating back to the 1600s, and Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger was already watching France's moves closely. Although Britain had declared neutrality, the French actions in Belgium were becoming harder to ignore, especially after they opened the River Scheldt for navigation, violating an old treaty. Pitt wasn't eager for war, but he couldn't stand by while France seemed ready to dominate the Low Countries. Then came the breaking point. Louis XVI was executed. This was a shock across Europe, and Pitt called it the foulest act the world has ever seen. From that point on, all diplomatic efforts were off the table. On February 1, 1793, France officially declared war on Britain and the Dutch Republic, dragging more European nations like Spain and Portugal into the anti-French coalition. But revolutionary France wasn't intimidated. In fact, they were more fired up than ever. Revolutionary leader Jacques-Pierre Brissot claimed they wouldn't stop until all of Europe was in flames. And driven by this ambition, the French pushed ahead. On that same day, General Dumouriez, who'd been leading the French in Belgium, was ordered to invade the Dutch Republic. Despite being one of France's most successful generals at this point, he had doubts about his cause, especially after the execution of Louis XVI. Dumouriez was a monarchist at heart, and he was frustrated with the constant interference from Paris. But, despite his misgivings, he moved forward with the invasion, crossing into the Dutch Republic with a reduced army. Dumouriez's initial moves went smoothly. He captured fortresses at Klundert, Breda, and Gertruydenburg, and planned to push all the way to Amsterdam, hoping to finish the campaign before the coalition could regroup. But while Dumouriez was making his plans, things were shifting against him. The National Convention back in France was a mess, split between moderate and extremist factions, and it was struggling to send him enough troops or supplies. Meanwhile, the coalition forces had organized. Thousands of Austrian soldiers were now moving westward, under the command of Prince Friedrich Josias of Saxe-Coburg-Zollfeld, determined to push the French out of Belgium and protect the Dutch Republic. By late February, this coalition army had crossed the Ruhr River, launching a surprise attack on a French force that was covering the siege of Maastricht. The French were caught off guard, and by March 2nd, the Austrians had driven them back to Louvain. With pressure mounting, Dumouriez had to make a decision. Reluctantly, he abandoned his campaign in Holland and returned to Belgium to face the coalition forces. By March 18th, the two armies lined up for a showdown on the plains of Neerwinden, near the Kleine Diet River. It was here that Dumouriez would face his biggest challenge yet. So on the morning of the Battle of Neerwinden, Dumouriez, leading the French forces, had chosen a battlefield that had been lucky for the French before, back in the 9 Years' War. This time he had around 40,000 infantry and 4,500 cavalry, while the coalition with around 30,000 infantry and 10,000 horsemen seemed like a pretty even match. Dumouriez's scouts had warned him that the Austrian defenses were particularly strong on their right, where they guarded their supply lines, so he decided to strike their left with his full force. By 7 a.m., Dumouriez's army, split into 8 columns, began their assault. French troops led by General Jean-Baptiste de Valence swarmed over the Kleine Diet River and pushed toward the hill of Middelwinden. They were hoping to break through the Austrian line there, but the Austrians weren't giving up easily. 4 brutal hours of fighting later, Valence finally captured the hill around noon. Meanwhile, at the center, the Duke of Chartres, Louis-Philippe, launched an assault on the village of Neerwinden. The village kept switching hands throughout the day as the French and Austrians fiercely counterattacked each other, but by nightfall, it was back in Austrian hands. Down south, near Oberwinden, the story was similar. The French took the town but were forced out by a determined Austrian counterattack. Finally, around noon, General Miranda led the last 3 French columns in an assault on Archduke Charles's strong defensive line. The French threw themselves at the Austrians again and again, but the Austrians stood firm, and Miranda's men suffered some of the bloodiest losses of the day: 2,000 men, 30 officers, and even 1 general. When Miranda's troops were too exhausted to continue, the Austrians charged and pushed the French back across the river. By nightfall, not much had changed on the battlefield except that the French left flank had been completely defeated. Dumouriez decided to retreat to Louvain the next morning instead of risking another fight with his forces weakened and his left exposed. The French had suffered around 4,000 casualties and lost another 1,000 soldiers as prisoners, while the Austrians had also lost about 2,700 men. But things didn't end there. Coburg, commanding the Austrians, wasn't about to let Dumouriez slip away without consequence. He followed the French, engaging them at Louvain on March 22nd, which forced Dumouriez to fall back to Brussels. His army was falling apart, down to just 20,000 as desertion surged. At this point, Dumouriez knew he couldn't face another major battle, so he decided to try negotiating his way out. Initially, Dumouriez had planned only to ask for a safe retreat from Belgium. But when he met with General Mack, the Austrian second-in-command, his plan took a wild turn. Instead of just retreating, he offered to lead his own troops back into France and march on Paris, arrest the revolutionary Jacobins, dissolve the National Convention, and even restore the monarchy with young Louis XVI's son as king. General Mack, seeing an opportunity, agreed to let Dumouriez try his coup. Now, Dumouriez's move might sound shocking, especially for the general who defended the revolution at Valmy and conquered Belgium. But the recent execution of Louis XVI and the increasing paranoia within the French government had left Dumouriez at odds with the revolutionary direction. He feared he'd be accused of treason if he returned, so he chose a risky preemptive strike over a potential execution. For days, Dumouriez tried to convince his soldiers to follow him back to Paris, but this wasn't easy. While many despised the new National Convention, most still believed in the Republic and didn't want to commit treason. His delay at the border only made him seem more suspicious. Eventually, his subordinate, General Miranda, slipped away to Paris to raise suspicions about Dumouriez's intentions. When Pierre de Bournonville, the French Minister of War, arrived with commissioners to investigate, Dumouriez's next move sealed his fate. He arrested Bournonville and handed him over to the Austrians. This act of defiance was the point of no return. Dumouriez could no longer hide his intentions, but he was losing support fast. His own troops had grown so hostile that he needed an escort of Austrian soldiers for protection. By April 5th, a battalion of French volunteers even tried to arrest him, forcing Dumouriez and a few loyal supporters to escape to the Austrian camp. With him went the Duke of Chartres, who would later return to France to become its last king, Louis-Philippe I. In the aftermath, Coburg took advantage of Dumouriez's defection to press forward into France. General Picot de Dampierre took command of the remaining French forces, continuing the fight, but was killed about a month later at Raismes. France's defeat at Neerwinden had turned the tide against the Republic. Where they had once gone on the offensive, they were now on the defensive. Coburg reclaimed Belgium, another French army was driven out of the Rhineland, and 20,000 French soldiers were besieged in Mainz. Back in Paris, tensions only increased after Dumouriez's betrayal, which intensified the divide between the Girondins and Jacobins. On June 2nd, many leading Girondins were arrested and later executed, marking a dark chapter in the revolutionary government's consolidation of power. The betrayals by both Lafayette and Dumouriez led the convention to tighten its control over the military, placing representatives on mission to oversee the generals. As for Dumouriez, he spent some time in Brussels, then moved to Cologne, where he unsuccessfully sought a place in the elector's court. With his reputation ruined, he ended up in London, where he spent his last years, even advising the British on their campaigns against Napoleon. Dumouriez would stay in England for the rest of his life, passing away in 1823, a figure remembered as both a hero and a traitor.